Welcome to The Lubber's Hole, a Patrick O'Brian podcast. You're with Ian.
And with Mike.
And the two of us together are rereading our favourite series of novels, the Aubrey Maturin books of Patrick O'Brian. Mike, this is a big week in our circumnavigation here. We're at the beginning of Blue at the Mizzen. So why don't you help us out, please? Give us a reminder of where we were at the end of the previous book and give us a hint of what might be coming in the opening paragraphs of this one.
Thanks, Ian. Happy to do it. Yeah, last time we closed off the 100 days. We remember, the impact. Barrett Bondin was killed in this chase before the gold galley was taken. The crew and the commander-in-chief almost lost all that prize money until yet another new day was installed. Lord Barmouth was not pleased by the way his wife and Jack were getting along. He told Jack to go amuse the young ladies in Chile. Queenie, Lord Keith, and an unnamed woman were waving goodbye as the surprise left for South America as we close that book. Well, in this book, we learn that the departure for Chile is short-lived as the surprise threatens to founder. Lord Barmouth is back. Lord Keith is not. And we learn about the differences between sailors and soldiers.
Oh, very good. Thank you, Mike. It's intriguing. And let's talk about what we're talking about a little bit as well. This is, as most of us know, the last complete book in the series. And it might be worth just thinking about how far the author and his world have come while we've been reading the previous 19 books. At the point of writing and publishing this book, Patrick O'Brian was in his 80s. We're going to find out exactly how far into his 80s shortly. He was a widower, as we know, when he picked up his pen in 1998 and then early 1999 to write this, as we say, the last complete work. We know that it is. I guess he did not at the time. So in some respects, in 1999, the peak of O'Brian fandom was catching up or even past us at this point. By this time, Dean King had already submitted the typescript for his unauthorized and eye-opening biography, Patrick O'Brian, A Life Revealed. At this point, the big promotional tours of the US with W.W. Norton were 4 years in the past, although I think he would have one further big junket in North America in 1999 itself. As Dean King evocatively wrote about in his book, the tide of concrete and brick apartment buildings and holiday villas was creeping up the hillside in Collier, so O'Brian's writing retreat there was not so much of a retreat anymore. And by the way, by 1999, a fellow by the name of Ian Bradley, on a family holiday in the south of France, had already made his first visit to Collier. There were TV documentaries on his life and character, albeit still obscure. They had been made and broadcast. The Gun Room, the stalwart platform for online fandom of all things O'Brian, had been going for 4 years by this point. Lobscouse and Spotted Dog, the famous cookbook with its own foreword by Patrick O'Brian himself, had been published in 1997, and we were creeping ever closer to the movie. By this time, Tom Rothman, head of 20th Century Fox, was already well on the way to achieving his passion project of developing and producing and then ultimately filming the Master and Commander movie that was going to begin filming principal photography just a couple of years after this point. So it's funny, Mike, we talked about O'Brian's life before and our life as readers after, but it really seems to me that at this point in history, in the history of the books anyway, the fandom and the author are really now back on the same track. It's not all great for O'Brian. Of course, he's alone. He's living some of his time at Trinity College in Dublin. And it seems like his efforts to keep his life in a bit of a lead box and away from his readers, it seems like all of that is starting to pass away. He had this stable but very obscure world of his anonymity and his reserve. That all seems to be starting to break up. And we were talking at the end of the last book, Mike, about how much of the aging and decay and kind of changed perspective present in the books is actually O'Brian's himself. And I'm wondering, as we start this book, how much of that breaking down of the familiar world are we going to see about and hear about from the author's perspective as we get into this book?
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous question. I agree with you. I'm wondering the same thing because we pointed out how much that seemed to affect the 100 days. And I started the same way. How much is it going to affect this book? Well, we join the surprise. It's 4 bells in the afternoon watch, 2 p.m. And the surprise is anchored 1/2 mile from Gibraltar, lying with the crew in their best clothes, looking at the captain, his officers, the purser, and the clerk, sitting beside barrels of 130 grain troy weight gold discs and other barrels of silver and copper waiting to be distributed as prize money, thanks to Lord Keith's efforts with the prize court.
Amen.
Each sailor steps forward as his name is called to receive their 157th part of a half share. Sounds pretty small, but it amounts to 382 pounds, 17 shillings, and 4 pence, minus any money that they had sent home on the advice of the captain and their divisional officers. Now, I don't know, did you scratch your head a little bit at this? I know I did.
Well, it's funny, isn't it? End of the last chapter of the previous book, they sailed away from the mole in Gibraltar with somebody waving, and now all of a sudden we're back at anchor. It reminds me of hearing somebody talking about the old days of Saturday morning movies and how you'd get to the end of a Tarzan movie and it would look like Tarzan had fallen into a pit of stakes in the jungle. And at the beginning of the next movie, the following Saturday morning, you see that by some miracle, Tarzan had managed to claw his way back from the edge and hadn't actually fallen into the pit. So let's be generous here. O'Brien's given us a bit of retrospective continuity, and it turns out that we're back at anchor, which is convenient for this particular aspect of the beginning of this particular story, right?
Stephen says to Jack that he wishes the Ringle could be here. Her crew had cheered as the ceremony had started right before the Ringle had left on a personal errand for Lord Keith. Jack agrees, but reminds Stephen that as a private tender to a hydrographical vessel, the Ringle and its crew would be standing in line for 4 pence alone. I know I was kind of twinging, going, whoa. Everybody on the crew is 382 pounds, but the Ringle, basically nothing. And Stephen says, well, he wanted them to be here because he wanted to give the youngsters a gold piece as a memento. Now, I'm thinking to myself, I'm not sure the youngsters would have saved it as a memento. That's one single gold piece of 130 troy is about 500 pounds today. So I'm not sure how long it would have stayed in their pocket, but it was a good thought, Stephen. And Jack says, well, Stephen, you can hand out your mementos when we rejoin the Ringle at Madeira.
Yeah, I mean, it's a nice idea of generosity. If I was aboard the Ringle, I think I might see it differently.
Right, I'm with you.
Anyhow, even though the rain is falling, and we all know that in fiction, when the rain is falling, it's falling for a reason, right? The waves increase and the sky darkens and the crew remains on deck, even after the last man is paid. And we get this really great spontaneous response from the crew. It's all along of the unicorn's horn. It's all along of the glorious hand. Huzzah, 3 times huzzah for the doctor. Lord, how they cheered their surgeon. And it's a really nice moment. We've heard this before from crews, even though Jack is a talk captain and spontaneous calling out like this is not his thing. He's pretty happy to see and hear all of this celebration on the side of the crew. He tells Harding then to set sail once things have calmed down a little bit. And he says, we're off now. We're headed for South America. If we get signaled or flagged down by a king's ship, we reply, carrying dispatches, and continue without breaking our pace. So all of the urgency that we've had, I'm like, 4, 5, 6 books ago, is all built up. And it feels like we're finally off. We're at sea. Jack is saying, without actually saying it, there's not a moment to lose. The sea is cutting up, though. It's pretty stormy. The boat is pitching violently, and Jack helps poor old landlubber Stephen to get back to his cabin. Jack is looking at the barometer, looking at the falling pressure, and he says the night is going to be even dirtier than he'd thought. He reflects that he's really glad that his friend and sponsor, Lord Keith and Queenie, had helped them get in shape and get out to sea so quickly. And we get a little signal here of the mood back in Gibraltar. They were glad, he says, to leave the continuing Gibraltar celebrations. The patriotic songs, self-praise and mocking the French, who had, after all, gone down fighting, outnumbered and with the utmost gallantry. Jibes that very often came from those who had had nothing whatsoever to do with the war. So Jack was a little bit sickened by all the jingoism around in Gibraltar. He's happy to be away from it. And he says, as much as Stephen loathes the Napoleonic system, he could not bear what he calls the obscene, gloating caricatures of Bonaparte that were everywhere to be seen. So, as we've often had before, Mike, life at sea, the concerns of the land slip away. We get this pure, unsullied connection with nature. It's all going to be great, right?
Right, right. And in addition to getting away from all this mocking of the French, Jack's particularly glad to have the men and their prize money far from shore.
Yeah.
And he reminds Stephen of their experience in Malta a few books back, where the men with a full share had received only $6 as opposed to, their huge payout now. And Jack had thought that these steady, settled men with $6 would be fine ashore. But the text says, this is Jack speaking, I was wrong. Once ashore, they kicked up Bob's a dying to a most shocking extent and then set about the soldiery. Stephen says, oh, yeah, I remember all the wounds that we treated from these fights with the soldiers. And then Jack hears this great hubbub on deck and runs out to figure out what's happening.
Yeah. Up he goes. We've had what sounds like a pretty serious naval accident here. The foretopmast staysail has carried away. He describes it as a damned awkward veering wind and as black as the devil's arse. He's impressed, though, with the men who've already managed to get the repair underway just as calmly as if it was broad daylight and calm conditions. But there you are, says Jack. That is your seaman. He can put up with uncommon dirty weather, endure great hardship and very short commons, a good, steady, courageous, uncomplaining creature under officers he can respect. He will bear all of that, and sometimes harsh punishment, shipwreck and scurvy. What he cannot bear is sudden wealth. It goes straight to their heads, and if there is the least possibility, they get drunk and disorderly and desert in droves. And Jack goes on to comment on how much worse Gibraltar would have been than Malta, with his men having so much money in their pockets. Each damn fool hand, he says, with 50 guineas in his pocket would have been blind drunk, poxed and stripped before Sunday, had we not got away. And I'd like for us to remember for a minute Jack's sentiment about regular sailors. Courageous, steady, uncomplaining? Let's see.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Killick interrupts him and reports that the green seas are coming aft as far as the capstan. And he says, the only way you guys are going to get your toasted cheese dry is if I bring the spirit stove up here and make it here. Can't cook it and carry it up. And he says, too, that the top light has come adrift again, and Daniels and some strong hands are working to fix it. And then he says to Stephen that Dr. Jacobs has taken a nasty tumble and there's blood all over the gunroom. Stephen jumps up to go tend to Jacobs and is flung forward shockingly as he stands. Killick and Jack luckily catch him, and Jack helps Stephen out into the utter darkness where he's blasted with rain and seawater. On deck, the master reports the continuing trouble they're having trying to fix this top light. Stephen, kind of looking up through this rain, can barely make out one small lantern hanging high in the sails here.
Wow. So it's a really filthy night. There are dangers just from the environment, just from the storms here, and the visibility is really bad. I wonder how this is going to work out. Down in the gun room, the officers, who are actually, you would think, pretty familiar with bloodshed, are nonetheless running around like a parcel of hens. Some of them are standing and wringing their hands. Stephen calls for pulse-keeping. She cuts away Jacob's sleeve. They press on the sparting brachial artery and some other sources of blood. It turns out that Jacob has turned a complete somersault over his chair and a stool and has cut himself with his shattered glass. This sounds like it could have been really serious. Fortunately, just as the crew were calm and organized and got the forced topmast staysail back in good shape, Stephen and Pulsekeeping and everybody else are pretty calm and resourceful, and they get Jacobs' arm back into good shape. Jack comes into the gunroom saying, things are now going great. We're making remarkable way. We're barely 6 points off the wind. Everybody's trying to tell Jack now about Jacob's accident. And then there's an enormous crash. The crash checks the surprises away. The ship comes to an almost complete stop. The lanterns swing violently against the deck overhead. And Mike, we can just imagine the disorientation and the sort of tumult going on down below. Up on deck, Lieutenant Huell tells Jack that a lookout had called light on the starboard bow. just before Yule saw a huge, dark, otherwise lightless craft coming before the wind at 10 knots or more, striking Surprise's bows, crossing her shattered stem, and running down her larboard side. It seemed to have been a heavy Scandinavian timber carrier. They couldn't see a name, they couldn't see a port or a flag. No hail came from her. The ship is now past them and gone. But all this damage is here, and this is really, really serious stuff. The ship's in imminent danger. The carpenter says the bowsprit and most of the head have carried away. The bosun says he can't answer for the health of the foremast. The carpenter's mate runs up saying we're making 5 tons of water a minute in the well. 5 tons a minute? Holy cow. This anxiety penetrates everyone around. Jack flies straight into action. He puts the ship before the wind, furls all of the sails apart from the main and forecourses, and he has the pumps manned. And Mike, we've been in this situation before. For all it's dark and windy and we feel the anxiety and we feel the urgency, part of me is going, yeah, but this is Jack Aubrey, and I remember the iceberg, and I remember various other storms. So I'm starting to feel okay that it seems like we have it under control. Jack gets the strong wind and the pounding sea on the quarter coming from behind the ship where it's undamaged. She no longer seems like she's about to sink. They inspect the damage, and it's not looking great. By the end of the middle watch, says the text, with the carpenter and his mates working as men will work with water pouring into their ship, the pumps were holding their own, or even very slightly gaining on the influx. And the carpenter's assessment is this: if ever you can bring her inside the mole and so into the yard, I shall forswear evil living and give half my prize money to the poor, for it is only the yard that can make her anything like seaworthy. And for all our excitement about finally being on the way to South America, we're going back again.
Yeah, if we can make it. Exactly.
Right. Fortunately, they do make it back. They're inside the mole. They're quickly spending the remaining hours of the night in relative peace, but back again alongside in Gibraltar.
A few hours of sleep, and in the morning, Jack sends a letter over along with his report to Lord Barmouth. He tells him what happens, he lists the damages, and he asks to meet with his lordship as soon as convenient. He wants the report delivered by their most respectable-looking midshipman, accompanied by a reliable man to see him there and back. And the text says, Bondon's name had been in his throat, and the checking of it caused an oddly searing pain. So many shipmates gone, but never a one to touch him for true worth. So I'm so glad to get at least one moment's reflection back on Bondon, and in a good way, not the way we seem to have reflected back on Diana at the beginning of 100 Days here. Yeah. Well, Jack gets a response. He reports back to Barmouth at 5:30. And as soon as he walks in, Isabel comes through a door that's behind the Admiral's desk and greets Cousin Jack warmly, invites him to dinner with them, and the Keith says Queenie wants to hear all about every detail on the poor Surprise. And O'Brien writes, Isabel Barmouth was and always had been a spirited creature, not to be put down easily, nor yet made to leave the room. But she was by no means a fool, and it was clear to her that obstinacy at this point might do Jack more harm than anything Barmouth could inflict on her. And, says later, for all his courage and his admitted virtues, she knew that he, that is Lord Barmouth, was capable of a shabby thing. And I'm thinking to myself, shades of Admiral Hart.
Yeah, we're 19 books ago back in Master and Commander and Treason's Harbour and all those other places. Wow. Well, after Isabel leaves, Barmouth says he's ordered his very few cruisers available out to sea to watch for any vessel in the vicinity of the Straits of Gibraltar that might have hit the Surprise. He's very concerned about the condition of the ship and wonders aloud to himself that it was even possible that Jack could have kept her afloat. But, he reflects, now that Jack has fulfilled Lord Keith's mission, the Surprise has reverted back to being a hired hydrographical vessel. That is to say, not really one of the Navy's own ships, but a private vessel. And she's completely detached from Barmouth's command in the Mediterranean, and he therefore can't put her repairs in front of the men of war who are waiting for urgent repairs for the regular business of the squadron here. Now, Mike, it seems that Barmouth either doesn't know about or has chosen not to care about the higher directive for the Surprise's mission to South America. This seems like perhaps it's just a chance for Barmouth to get in the way of Jack a little bit and to enforce his authority. So meanwhile, he temporizes. He says he'll look into Jack's request for a less exposed berth in the meantime, because that might help to keep the Surprise in slightly better shape for slightly longer. Now, Mike, we've had a lot of storms and alarms and toing and froing and anchor and alongside and underway. One thing we haven't had yet in this chapter of this book is a dinner.
And here we go. At dinner, Queenie and Isabel welcome Jack kindly. Jack breaks off to thank Lord Keith for his help at the prize court. And Lord Keith begs Jack's pardon for keeping the Ringle for so long, on this personal favor that he had asked Jack. He knows that she would have been most helpful to the Surprise in the accident, getting back to the mole, and finding the vessel responsible. Now, he commends William Reed for being an excellent young man, and Jack takes the time to say that he's really sorry that Reed, because he was on the private vessel, won't get to share in the prize money, which would have come in really handy since with the peace, Reed's probably going to be thrown on the shore with his lieutenant's pay and no chance of getting a ship with the war over. So I think this is Jack's way of saying, Lord Keith, if you like Reed so much, you could do him a favor here, because I really don't have the influence to get him a ship.
Yeah. Well, this is all starting to sound a bit less than comfortable for Jack here. Meanwhile, other guests arrive at this dinner. Jack gets seated in between Isabel and Colonel Roche, who's just come back from Paris. And we don't get to hear much yet about how Jack and Isabel are getting along as dinner guests, but we do get to hear a lot about the conversation with the Colonel. Jack asks him for a blow-by-blow account of the battle at Waterloo. Roche points out that it was a series of battles over many days, unlike the shorter naval battles, and that Roche had been Wellington's aide-de-camp, so he had a good view of the field. And he goes on and tells them. And Mike, it's a really nice bit of exposition of history, nicely presented in the social setting of our heroes in the story here. He talks about the culmination on the 18th day of June, 1815. They had thought that the Prussians might not join them because of a Prussian defeat that had happened the day before and a change in the command of the Prussian army due to the injury to Marshal Blucher. Overnight, they received a message that this former commander Blucher was actually coming, after all, with 2 to 4 corps, but most people didn't believe it. And if I remember my Waterloo history right, Bonaparte didn't expect it either. The next day, the Duke of Wellington accepted battle with 68,000 men and 56 guns against Napoleon's 74,000 men and 246 guns. The rain had hampered the French, and they weren't set up to attack until 11 in the morning. And at this point in the narration, the whole table is paying close attention to what the colonel says. Barmouth asks him to lay out the location of the key units in the battlefield with bottles and pieces of bread. Later, he says he had seen Prussian blue at the edge of the woods and had let the Duke of Wellington know. The Duke pointed Roche's glass in the direction of the Emperor, and they saw within minutes the French staff officer that had witnessed the same thing and were now galloping off in different directions. The Prussians are here. Some French cavalry and infantry left their positions and moved toward the Prussians, and meanwhile Marshal Ney on the French side attacked the Allied centre. He had failed. 2 of Lord Uxbridge's cavalry brigades had ridden right over them, had captured 2 eagles, these French standards that were, what did we say, a disgrace to lose and a triumph to win, as explained to Mr. Wright. And now we get to the heart of the Waterloo story that lots of you listeners will read and know very well. If you haven't read it, really, really recommend digging into this. It's a really, really fascinating, exciting, and really bloody, bitter, harrowing account of this really great battle. Ney attacked the farm at La Haye Sainte in the centre again with this really, really shocking cannonade. The Allies withdrew from La Haye Sainte for better cover, having held on to it for lots of the earlier days of the battle. The French mistake this for a genuine retreat. They launch cavalry squadrons. The horses can only just trot uphill, and they meet the Allied infantry formed into squares. Gunfire and cavalry drive the French back down the slope. The French cuirassiers and the Imperial Guard cavalry falling behind. And now 80 squadrons on the French side are making this furious attack. But they're all driven down the hill. There are other components and sub-battles going on around them, but Napoleon's forces making more progress there are still held up in the centre. He sends Ney back up the hill one more time, takes La Haye Sainte because all the Allied troops left there have used up their ammunition. The Duke is pretty undisturbed. The battle's finally poised, but he can see that 2 of those Prussian corps have finally joined the battle, so the Duke can move 2 of his fresh cavalry brigades from the right wing to strengthen the centre, where all the French attacks are going on. The Imperial Guard and the rest of Napoleon's reserve strength attacked one last time in the centre. They had great courage, but not enough men. The Guard fell back. The Prussians broke through. It was a rout, and that was the end. And Mike, the Colonel's done a really, really great job telling the story here, and it seems to us like he's got all the key facts and figures of the battle are pretty much correct as they're reported here.
Yeah, and as you had said, Ian, it was a really, really bloody battle. In The World of Patrick O'Brien by Dean King, he reports that Napoleon lost 23,000 dead and wounded, 7,000 prisoners, but the Allied casualties just as high. Wellington, 15,000 casualties, Blucher, 7,000. Napoleon retreats to Paris and then surrenders to the British Navy on July 15th, 1815. So a decisive battle, a decisive loss. But it's interesting. We were talking earlier, the scale of loss here compared to something like Trafalgar, which by all accounts kind of historically more significant. Yeah. But how does that compare to Trafalgar?
Well, tens and tens of thousands of losses on both sides at Waterloo, much smaller scale, like 1 in 5 or 1 in 7 at Trafalgar. On the British side, 1,500 dead and wounded. On the French side, 7,000 dead and wounded, plus another 7,000 or 8,000 captured. And as you say, Mike, Trafalgar arguably had a much bigger impact on the course of the war. Napoleon was still near the apex of his powers and his potentialities. You can argue that by the time we got to Waterloo, it was inevitable that Napoleon was going to get defeated. It was a matter of how soon and at what cost. But both battles are lodged firmly in the memories, at least of British and European people, as the centerpieces of these great struggles between the Allies and the Napoleonic forces. And both end up being the cause of the renaming of landmarks in central London. We seem to like naming landmarks in London after defeats of the French. Not so many landmarks named about our defeats when we were in conflict against the Dutch and the Germans and the Spanish and everybody else. But there you go. We seem to really like bragging about beating the French. I apologize to all our French listeners.
Well, after dinner over port, Jack tells Roche that he's never had the honor of meeting the Duke of Wellington. Surely he must be a very great man, asked Jack. Roche says he is. And he says, he kind of has this incredible ability to say things just straight off, not studied. He has these wonderful quotes off the top of his head. And Jack asks him, can you give me some examples? And I'm thinking to me, Jack wants to add to his Lord Nelson quote collection here. And Roche says, well, as they wrote about the field right after the battle, seeing this shocking number of dead, Wellington said, next to a battle lost, the greatest misery is a battle gained. And I'm thinking to myself, I think Jack's had some of those similar sentiments before in the canon here. Yeah, love that. And he says that later, going to France, the Duke had said, it has been a damn serious business. Blucher and I have lost 30,000 men. It has been a damned nice thing, the nicest run thing you ever saw in your life. By God, I don't think it would have done if I had not been there. So he very much wanted to be there, very much wanted to see it, but very much understood the magnitude and the loss involved there.
Yeah. And as you say, Mike, we've heard lots of these sentiments from Jack before. This little tag, it was a damn near run thing, a damn nice run thing. Aubrey himself has said that many times in the canon. I was looking up on the Singularity lookup here. He said exactly the same thing in the Commodore and in the Wyandotte Sea and in Nutmeg of Consolation and in Reverse of the Medal.
Nice.
So this is one of those Wellington tropes that's part of Jack Aubrey's vocabulary now. And I'm pretty sure I said at the time, people wrote the same thing about the Falklands conflict in 1982. And again, Mike, we've got this really nice, accurate, tidy picture presented by Colonel Roche of what happened at Waterloo. All the quotes and aphorisms that are attributed to Wellington all do seem to stand up. He had this, he had a couple of other things to say about the battle, which we'll come to in a second. Maybe the only thing you can say to Carp in a very, very small way is that this is a very clear, balanced, complete picture. And I bet that even somebody who was an aide-de-camp to Wellington within a few weeks after the battle would have struggled to give this kind of a complete picture. So I think into the mouth of Colonel Roche is being placed the perspective of, a couple of centuries worth of history and evaluation and chronicling of the battle. It was a really, really huge and complex and miserable thing. So we get on to the next thing that Roche has to say about soldiers. And this becomes an interesting focus, I think, for Jack and his thoughts in the rest of the chapter. Jack and the Colonel walk outside. They're smoking cigars. And Roche says, once he, meaning the Duke of Wellington, also said that his men were the scum of the earth, or perhaps mere scum of the earth. That was well before Waterloo. He said it quite often, I believe, and I first had it at second hand. And Roche said that he had resented the Duke, saying this about his soldiers, until he accompanied him back to Paris, and he saw what they called drunkenness, riot, insubordination, theft, looting, and open rape, even when they were in Belgium. They had flogged men every day. It made no difference. He was glad to be rid of them and formed the conclusion, he said, that men subjected to very strong discipline may behave like devils the moment they are released from it. Jack nodded, saying, yes, I'm sure. But his tone implied that, although the words were quite true of the army, sailors were, upon the whole, of a different nature. And Mike, not for the first time in this chapter, we're going to say to all you Lubbers Hole bingo players out there, stick a pin in that idea. And by the way, he did say, use exactly that phrase about his soldiers and describe them as mere scum of the earth. He still admired and loved his soldiers and admired and loved his officers, but I think that's a true thing that he did say about them. Now, if soldiers and sailors alike can be the worst for drink when they're set ashore with a lack of discipline, I hope that we are all, Mike, going to remember our discipline and remember the orders of our superior officers when we step away for a couple of minutes to maybe set foot ashore, grab a little glass of something, be polite to the local populace, and we'll see you back aboard ship in just a couple of minutes. If you're enjoying the podcast, please come and join our supporters on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/lubbershole.
Welcome back. The text continues here. On his way up from the dockyard to Lord Barmouth's house, Jack Aubrey had been aware of a dark, sullen, dogged, ominous cloud at the back of his mind. But in spite of its almost tangible presence, he had enjoyed his evening. He was very fond of Queenie and, though in another way, O'Brien writes, of Isabel. Yeah, here we go. On his way back to the ship, that sullen cloud moves to the front of his mind and his spirits sink. He sits down, realizes that he gave Roche his last cigar, and he goes back to thinking about Roche's remarks about soldiers, deciding, no, the sailor is a different animal. So again, we're saying stick a pin in this. Stick a pin in this. Jack is convinced.
Yes, and this next paragraph is actually kind of painful to read in a way. It's certainly not a happy time for Jack Aubrey. And I'm reading this thinking, if only they hadn't collided with the Scandinavian, whatever it was, timber. If only they'd made it across the pure blue briny ocean. If only. But if only doesn't cut it. We are back here among the squalor and the rapidly shifting sentiment ashore in Gibraltar. Jack Aubrey turns a corner and hears the loud, familiar voice of his own quartermaster, name of Higgs, addressing a good-sized group, saying, "There ain't no martial law. The war's over," and he says the Surprise ain't a man of war no longer, but a surveying vessel. We've got our money, he says, we can do as we please. They can't do nothing to us. And someone who's drunker than most in the crowd calls out, "Wilkes and liberty!" And we all probably remember just a few books ago that Jack's kids had been marching around shouting this slogan, Wilkes and liberty, when Jack's father, their particular grandfather, had become a radical. And this guy, John Wilkes, was a libertarian, and we'll hear some more about him in a second. Higgs says that merchantmen are weeping, crying out for hands. They pay £8 a month, free tobacco, prime eating. He says, "I'm going home." And after much hallooing among the crowd, he shouts, "There ain't no martial law. We are not slaves." And you can kind of almost imagine them getting up a bit of a chant here. And Mike, like I said, my heart sinks a little bit here. Not only because of Jack needing to be among all this squalor, which is clearly associated with life in Gibraltar, rather than life aboard ship. But because it does encompass the crew of the Surprise, these are his men. And these are the same men and the same sentiment that only recently had been saying Huzzah for the Unicorn and had been singing songs mocking Bonaparte and celebrating the victory. Those same men and that same sentiment turned pretty dark pretty quickly. And Mike, to call back to another thought from a couple of paragraphs ago, maybe it's not only admirals, but also enlisted sailors who are capable, as Jack is realizing, of doing a shabby thing. Or maybe, Mike, it's nothing to do with sailors and admirals. Maybe it's just human beings and human nature.
Yeah, yeah. And maybe that's why O'Brien's palette seems to be filled with so many shades of gray and not quite as much black and white.
Yeah.
Well, speaking of black and white and shades of gray, O'Brien continues writing. He says, this falling apart of the frigate's crew, this disintegration of a community was, of course, the darkness that he had kept back through the dinner and his happy evening with Isabel and Queenie. So he's talking about Jack here, saying this is that dark thing at the back of Jack's mind. It could not but have been there, Jack being of the sea briny, deeply aware of its motions and of the motions of those who sailed upon it. He had been conscious of the hand's discontent even before it was formulated. Naturally, with the war over, they wanted to go home and have a good time. But he was not going to lose his ship or his voyage if he could help it. And I just have to pause. I don't know. Maybe it's just me, but I remember when I heard Patrick Tall read this, I had to stop, rewind, listen to it again, then open up my Kindle and read through it. I just think this is a fabulous O'Brien paragraph. Jack being of the sea briny, conscious of the hand's discontent before they formulated it. This is prime writing.
It's really great, isn't it? It's really great. And maybe we talked at the very beginning about all the dislocation and change in O'Brien's life. The writing talent is undimmed here. It's really, really strong stuff. Now, Jack is reflecting on the meaning of what he's just seen, and it occurs to him that actually the present surprises, given how the crew was brought together and with all of the hurry attendant to them going to sea at the beginning of the 100 days, he says the present surprises are actually a motley lot. This is not his crack Shelmerston crew and his devoted followers. This is a fairly mixed bag, including men from the press. The ones that were just ordinary seamen were the least skilled, good only for pulling a rope, as he thought to himself. Natural members of the afterguard meaning not the skilled foremast hands. Now, full of life and full of gin, those same unskilled sailors are forming up behind Higgs, and they're marching into town shouting this slogan, "There ain't no martial law." Now, we get a fresh perspective on this as Mr. Wright, our engineer, he who rebuilt the Naval Tusk, walks up behind Jack and asks if it can be true that there isn't any martial law. Jack says he's profoundly ignorant of the law, but if he was at home and was in his role as a magistrate at this moment, he'd be inclined to read them the Riot Act. Now, Jack and Mr. Wright walk around behind the seamen until they come to this great big bonfire at the crossroads with people dancing around it. They're dancing around anti-clockwise, which I seem to remember in sort of ancient Anglo-Saxon superstition is something to do with conjuring evil spirits. I don't know, but certainly dancing anti-clockwise is associated with the occult somehow. And Jack says that Maturin would love to see Mr. Wright, but the ship is too damaged to invite him to a formal dinner, so he invites Mr. Wright to dine with him and Stephen at the Crown. And Jack then goes on and says he'll pick Mr. Wright up at his inn at the George and walk him over to the Crown since the streets are so full of people. And Mike, there's something interesting to land on here. Jack says that if he had been in his role as a magistrate, he would have read them the Riot Act. And you and I know, have used that phrase a lot to say somebody's going to be kind of angry and throwing their authority and their discipline around reading the Riot Act. But this means something specific, right?
It does. It does. I was amazed to learn this, Ian. I think perhaps you with British history knew this better, but for me, I was like, wait, the Riot Act? The Riot Act is really something here? Yes, yeah. The Riot Act of 1714, 1715, different authorities call it one or the other here. And I'll just quote from Wikipedia, one of my favorites, not for you scholars out there. The act created a mechanism for certain local officials to make a proclamation ordering the dispersal of any group of 12 or more people who were, quote, unlawfully, riotously, and tumultuously assembled together. If the group failed to disperse within 1 hour, then anyone remaining gathered was guilty of a felony without benefit of clergy, punishable by death. So this is, it's like, okay, wow, this is pretty heavy duty stuff. 12 or more people gathered, been told there. And interestingly, it worked kind of like it, for those of you who've watched the movies and the Miranda rights in the US, you literally read them the riot act, as we say here. You say, as our sovereign lord the king charges and commandeth all persons being assembled immediately to disperse themselves and peaceably to depart to their habitations or to their lawful business, upon the pains contained in the act made in the first year of King George for preventing tumults and riotous assemblies. God save the king. So, you read them the riot act, and then they got to go or suffer the consequences. And consequences there were, right, Ian?
Right. The Riot Act was used notoriously to put down savagely demonstrations and protests, mostly related to industrialization and the emerging rights of laborers. Famously, the very bloody Peterloo massacre in Manchester in 1819 involved the reading of the Riot Act. But there's an even closer, even more O'Brien-adjacent connection. There was a massacre in 1768 at St. George's Fields related to large numbers of protesters gathering outside the King's Bench prison in Southwark to protest against the incarceration of none other than John Wilkes, he of Wilkes and Liberty fame. And officials at that particular protest feared that the crowd would forcibly release Wilkes. Troops arrived to guard the prison, and after some more provocation by the rioters, the troops opened fire on the crowd. There were fatalities, including people not taking part in the riot who were hit by stray rounds. And although the act itself doesn't provide for the use of lethal force, it provides for the riotous assembly immediately becoming a felony. And it is believed by some scholars that after that point, the idea that reading the Riot Act gave permission for lethal force kind of came about from the case law that emerged from the Wilkes 1768 St. George's Fields massacre. The act stayed in law for quite a while. It was last used in anger, though the Riot Act was formally read to a crowd in 1919 at a demonstration of striking workers in Liverpool, and I think it was finally repealed from English statute law in the 1970s. But we got a little bit more civilized, and we started to wean ourselves off of our public taste for shooting at protesters.
I'm thinking back going, boy, I'm glad they didn't have the Riot Act at the 1968 Democratic Convention, thinking about the days of my youth. But, right. Wait, they acted like they did anyway. Well, Jack continues walking. His plan is to go to the surveyor's office, even though it's late, and find out if there's some senior officials he can talk to there. But he soon finds his way blocked by a mass of people ahead and behind. He really can't move. Sailors from two different ships are fighting with one another on one side, while on another side, a different group of sailors is trying to break into a large wine shop, which is being defended by a bunch of well-armed guards. Jack looks over a different direction, and a well-known brothel has clearly been taken by storm, its naked inhabitants climbing over the roof, pursued by another group of sailors. Jack's unable to move. He's coughing from the smoke of different fires which have been set, and he returns to thinking about, indeed, whether sailors and soldiers are really, on the whole, quite different creatures. And O'Brien writes the kind of culminations of Jack's thoughts here. And perhaps they are too. Yet perhaps drink in very large quantities may make the difference less evident.
Nice bit of rationalizing by Jack Aubrey, who's Navy to his core and can't think a bad thought, really, about the Navy as a whole. But he's seeing the world in a new light, not least because war is over. So the Wilkes and Liberty protesters have got that part right. And maybe this is a sign of the naval family starting to decay and fragment a little bit. And again, Mike takes us back to the question we asked ourselves at the beginning here. O'Brien's world is starting to decay and fray a little bit. Meanwhile, the Riot Act And the British Redcoats' inclination for taking care of Wright's assembly comes back to life here in Gibraltar. There's a blast of trumpets, and a body of disciplined troops with fixed bayonets clears the streets with wonderful speed and efficiency. We don't hear about whether there are any casualties or not. From Jack's perspective, I guess we don't really mind. These are followed by constables who go around seizing the offenders and drag them bound up to a mule cart used for night soil. So that's the nightly sewage gathered up from the streets. It's quite the scene we're painting here. Quite the Dante's Inferno. Chaos and tumult in blue at the Mizzen. So, despite this very, very distasteful, disorderly scene, it seems like it's all been taken care of. And Jack, as he goes on through his journey here, begins to see signs of order. He's saluted by soldiers as he passes through the squares. He feels a blessed ordinariness descending upon Gibraltar. He's out in search of various officials. None of the higher officials are to be found in the surveyor's office. It turns out they've been gone for 3 hours, and maybe that's because they keep slack hours, or maybe they were trying to stay out of the way of the crowds. Jack, therefore, sits outside the hospital, drinking what sounds a very delicious cocktail, an iced mixture of wine, orange juice, and lemon juice through a straw, as he watches up ahead in the sky Arcturus growing clearer every moment. So it's great that Jack gets a moment to bask in this blessed ordinariness, and it's very characteristic of Patrick O'Brian that he signals the mood change by talking about the sky, right, Mike?
All right, always.
Yeah.
Well, Stephen finally comes out of the hospital, apologizes, says he just didn't know that Jack was waiting. He's been inside, he says, exchanging the smallest of small talk this age and more. And I thought to myself, well, I'd love to see Stephen exchanging the smallest of small talk. We don't often see that. But he comments that Jack appears to be low in his spirits. Jack tells him all about the dinner and inviting Mr. Wright to dine with them the next day, and about hearing the account of Waterloo. And then finally he gets to Stephen's point about his low spirits. And O'Brian writes, "And I tell you what it is, Stephen, the surprises as a ship's company no longer exist. I fear the new drafts and above all this ill-timed and excessive prize money have destroyed it. How I wish our Marines had not been taken from us." And after a silence then, he tells Stephen he's not sure what to do because he just doesn't know what his position is in naval or civil law about the surprise and his powers aboard her. He's decided not to do anything until he speaks with Lord Keith in the morning. Lord Keith, he thinks, he's going to know something about the law and what Jack can and can't do in this position here.
It's great, isn't it? He really depends on his mentor, Keith. And interestingly, in a way, he's depending on mentoring from Keith to help cement his identity. I think it's Jack's identity in the world is left a little bit hazy by all of this change in status for the surprise and the change to peacetime conditions. And it's clearly an unsettling moment for Jack. Now, we're not done with hearing about the consequences of the drunken revels in Gibraltar, because the next day, when they go to pick up Mr. Wright, the innkeeper asks Stephen to go up and look at him. 3 drunken sailors, we learn, had come along and knocked him down and robbed him. And the innkeeper's husband had just about managed to run them off with a horse pistol. Stephen attends to Dr. Wright for a moment, comes back down and tells Jack it's okay. It's just bruises and a grazed elbow. But in his very telling sentence here, he says, "For a very aged man, the emotional, the spiritual disturbance is almost the equivalent of a broken limb for a lively youth." And at least he says that counts for the ancient when they are not wholly self-absorbed. And Mike, this is really very spare in economical writing, but very self-reflective. You've got to think that O'Brien's writing about this condition of being older and being very easily shaken up. I think that we read somewhere in the text that Wright is 85 at this time, which is the same age that O'Brian is at the time of publishing the book. And as we said at the very beginning, by this time, O'Brian was living in rather dislocated situations. He was living with Trinity College. The book is dedicated to his sort of temporary landlord at Trinity College. And he must have been feeling very, very easily dislocated himself as well.
It sure seems that way to me, and I agree with you.
Meanwhile, then, Killick brings a message from the innkeeper about Mr. Wright. And we get a little insight into the state of Killick at this point. Killick's own voice is heavy and slurred. He tries with naval fortitude to stand upright, but he is hopelessly drunk. He excuses himself to inform the Crown to have their support ready in half an hour. Very impressive level of naval tenacity in the face of intoxication there from our man Killick.
Yeah, and I think as you say, Ian, here it is. We've had this problem with all these new pressed hands and everything else, but even Killick has kind of given in some here, which has a little bit, makes you wonder a little bit. Well,
Yeah.
O'Brien gives us a little bit of the what's going on around him. With the Surprise barely inhabitable, the crew, he tells us, is living all over town. And this is Jack's worst nightmare come true. The war's over, party atmosphere. The Surprises have way too much time, way too much money. Most of the officers are at the Crown. The superior warrant officers are at the Blue Boar. And almost all of the ship's company are in a disused barracks with food and beer supplied by the dockyard in exchange for stores that have been removed from the Surprise. And they're all living out here. And we go to the next morning. Jack has Harding and Huell join him for breakfast at the Crown. And Summers comes in, and Jack says, Lieutenant Summers, why don't you join us here at the table? He says, well, he's sorry to bring such bad news, and tells him that most of the hands have deserted overnight. And Jack, is really, I think, wondering about this. He had seen everyone not granted shore leave into their hammocks at lights out before. He had spoken to the responsible bosun's mates and quartermasters. He left orders with the sergeant of the soldiers that guarded the outer gate of these barracks here. Now, he finds out that a few old Surprises are left in the barracks, and they complain about the food, but say they really know nothing about their shipmates' disappearance. And we've seen this before. Even though we're loyal, we're not informers here. And Jack says, well, they've probably just gone over the line to Spain, and asks Mr. Summers again to join them. He asks Harding to please arrange a muster aboard the Surprise at noon for the entire ship's company, and he'll get there as soon as he comes back from calling on the Admiral.
Oh, Mike, this sounds like a bit of a roll of the dice by Jack. I think, to me, this sounds like he calls for a muster, and he hopes but doesn't dare expect to see very many of his crew left there. And it's striking as well that this is in the same trip and on the same day and at the same time as he goes to visit his old mentor, Lord Keith. And I'm thinking that getting a bit of encouragement from Lord Keith is going to fortify him for what bad news he might encounter when he sees how many of his hands are going to show up for this muster. Keith is not around, but Queenie receives him and tells him that the person running the Keith's prize estate back in Scotland has done a very Aubrey ashore kind of number on them. He's deceived them, he's made off with a lot of money, he left the estate in debt and heavily encumbered. Queenie's pretty much distraught with this. She's never seen her husband so affected. It's like he has a disease, she says, sitting and writing letters as fast as he can and then tearing them up. She'll tell Lord Keith in any case that Jack has called. So, Mike, we've got another person whose world has been kind of shattered and spun around and dislocated a little bit here. Jack then returns through the blazing heat in his really heavy uniform coat, doesn't know any more than he did before about really what his legal position and his authority is. He bumps into Stephen and Jacob smoking a hookah on the veranda of the Crown. He says he's glad to see that Jacob's recovered. Jacob says, no problem, it was just a bloodletting. Jacob tells them that the men that he's looking for have not gone over the line into Spain, but have hired some fishermen on the other side of the rock to take them across to the Spanish shore for 2.5 ounces of silver each. That's quite a tariff in silver, I think. Very opportunistic work by the fishermen there. Harding, meanwhile, joins and reports that the muster is set for noon. And I have this picture in my head of the sun beating down, Mike, and Jack standing there at the break of the quarter deck, hoping against hope that he's going to see more than just a few of his old shipmates showing up for muster.
Yeah, and it's fascinatingly, it's a replay of the opening scene of the chapter. Everybody's on the quarterdeck, except this time there aren't these barrels of money to be handed out. That's all gone. And they start with Anderson just like they did last time, except there's no response. There's no reply. So they put an R for run next to Anderson's name. And so on it goes, one after another after another. But Jack is surprised by the number of old surprises who are there. From his officer's tone earlier, he'd expected far fewer. Jack greets every one of them by name, and O'Brien writes, and they answered with such evident and personal goodwill that it canceled the absence of many a good seaman, to say nothing of wasters and members of the afterguard. So, yeah, a lot of people are gone. Some of them are good seamen, but the old surprises, pretty much all of them, are still there. And I think Jack ends up heartened by the muster, and then even happier to hear that the Ringle has just made her number. So not expecting the Ringle to come in, Jack's like, okay, maybe we're going to get through this here. Well, Jack and the carpenter take time after the muster to examine the ship more thoroughly. And they're thinking, since the yard isn't going to get to her for a very long time, he asked Chips, the carpenter, if he knows any commercial local carpenters who could get the ship into good enough conditions for her to sail to a yard in Madeira. If we can get her to a yard in Madeira, we can get her fixed up much quicker than sitting here. Well, Chips does know some, but says they're going to be expensive. Yeah, not only will they be expensive, but of course, Jack's going to have to sweeten a lot of palms to even smuggle these outside carpenters into the naval yard. Jack says, hey, let's do it. And you can tell them that they're going to have a handsome present if the surprise can swim before the new moon. So here's this auspicious new moon yet again. Jack is wanting to get the heck out of Dodge, it sounds like.
Right. And again, a hark back to the very beginning of the canon. We know that Jack knows what the score is when you're dealing with tradesmen and artificers on shore and how to get stuff done in a hurry. Now, he tells Stephen about this plan, how he's going to get the ship to Madeira and then home for Seppings' yard. Stephen's quite surprised to hear home and wonders a little bit more about what exactly this trip is going to consist of. Jack says, well, I've got to get back to Seppings' yard. I've got to gather a crew of real seamen, in parenthesis, not the backsliding libertarians who are charging about the quayside of Gibraltar, but my proper guys, my Shelmastonians. The kind that he says he's going to need for the Horn, for surveying around the coast, and for helping the Chileans. Stephen says, well, it seems to be a pity that the guys that you had have all run off. And Jack says, well, there was nothing for them here apart from hard work, short commons, and hard lying. No possibility of prizes, and no home leave. And it's, again, very, very generous of Jack to have these noble and kind of forgiving motives that he's willing to ascribe to his shipmates. If they had stayed, he thinks maybe the boatswain and his mates and the officers could have turned that ragtag and bobtail crew into something like real seamen. And he goes on and says, once even indifferent seafarers are no longer in demand, which will be in a month or two, and once their money is spent, which will likely be sooner by far, a berth in the Surprise might be something to be envied. So he's pretty sanguine that he has good chances of picking up a crew from seamen coming off of King's ships in the peace. He says, we can handle a Surprise with the crew that we have now, but we can't fight her. So, Mike, we have yet another plan for getting away and getting to sea, this time against the hope that there's going to be no fighting between here and Madeira. I wonder how this is going to work out.
Right. Well, Stephen's worried about something different, not just getting to Madeira. He's worried about the folks that they've made this deal with in Chile. He's telling Jack they have a high revolutionary fervor. They're eager for results, almost immediate results. And all of this sounds like this is going to take a lot of time. And he asks, will they wait? Jack says, well, they really don't have a choice. He goes on to say, it's not every day that government fits out a man of war to chart their waters and do little acts of kindness on the way. Stephen says, well, I hope you're right, my dear, but do not forget that they are foreigners. Jack being Jack, there's some things that I love that are continuously the kind of, well, to be sure, that is very much against them, poor souls. Yet, from what you have told me, they have been very steadily set upon independence for many years now. Nothing very flighty or enthusiastic in that, I believe. When we were in London, or elsewhere for that matter, Should you like me to speak to their heads of the mission and put the case to them in plain seaman-like terms, he asked Stephen. They could not fail to be convinced. End of chapter 1.
Wow. So if this story is going to get to continue, we're being told it's going to continue because of the absolute naval tenacity and certainty and optimism and doggedness of Jack Aubrey. He's got enough of all of those things for everybody, including mutinying sailors and Chileans and the French and admirals and everybody else.
Right.
Wow. Mike, it's quite the sort of chapter 1 full of reverses. Perhaps we should say that's not really surprised, but who saw this coming? I mean, we had the waving woman on the quay at the end of the last book, and off we go to Chile. But here we are, and we're back where we started.
Right. I'm thinking to myself, okay, so I know being delayed in getting to South America is a trademark in this series.
Yeah.
I really thought we were off, but here we are back. And we're back in port where we can see Barmouth is no friend, but at this moment doesn't appear to be an active enemy. So he's, it's like, sorry, young man, there's nothing I can do for you. But Lord Keith's so out of commission. That worries me a little bit. I was hoping that if we have to be back, we'd have Lord Keith to kind of balance out Lord Barmouth and help Jack there.
We had as well this really fascinating account of Waterloo, and it makes us wonder, did we have that served up to us as a way to tie up the plot lines of the previous book about the 100 Days and kind of set us free to go back into Aubrey Maturin's surprise fiction timeline? Or did it also help to set up this debate of the discipline and the good order and the good conduct of soldiers versus sailors? Or was this simply the chance to set up a straw man for O'Brien to use to bring us back to the idea that we're all humans and we're imperfect and we live somewhere on this spectrum of shades of gray?
Yeah, it's a great question, Ian. It's a great question. I'm delighted myself that while we have these shades of gray, and we know in the canon, some are darker than others, I was glad to see that the old surprises stayed. I think I would have been devastated if we'd lost Bondin and then most of the other ones left. And I would have understood a number of them coming to the captain, going through the chain of command and saying, I'd like to go open up the next Aubrey Arms with all this money here. Do you mind, sir, if I head out for family and friends here? But seeing all of them take off after some drunk sea lawyer to grab a cushy job on the merchantman, I think that would have really been a downer for me.
It would have, and especially for Jack, with he's clinging to the remains of his identity here, with clinging to this hope that the Navy family is going to see him right. So, I mean, Jack's plan then seems clear. He seems that he still knows that what he's got to do is get the ship fixed up well enough to get to Madeira and then home, to find a good crew and get a complete fit out before heading to Chile at long last. Mike, that sounds like a good plan. It's the 20th book, right? So O'Brien maybe is going to set aside his habits of the previous 19, and we're just going to let that plot line continue smoothly along? No, maybe not. There's going to be some way that this thing is going to turn out not to be running smoothly. What fun would it be if things were predictable? And we've got an idea of what Jack seems to want. What about Stephen? What about Christine Woods? She wasn't too far from Stephen's mind at the end of the last book, so I wonder whether he holds out any hope of rekindling that relationship. He seemed to be questioning Jack quite closely about where we're headed next, and I wonder what's on his mind. And then, speaking of relationships, what does Jack Aubrey want from the rest of his life at this point? I don't know if he realistically now has any chance, since we're in peacetime, of escaping the yellowing that we talked about 2 books ago. Is he in danger of returning to his old rakish ways in company with Isabel Barmouth? His naval family seems to be crumbling around him a little bit, but it's been many chapters since we heard about Sophie and the rest of his real-world family. Where are they in all of this?
Yeah, and talking about beloved characters, I think I read this first chapter in trepidation that there was going to be yet another death. I was so glad there wasn't, and I do hope that while we had all this chaos and tumult, that we don't see that continuing in this book. But we do seem in this first chapter to be wrapped up in a kind of a chaotic world. The war's over, but the chaos is going on here. I'm wondering, is this going to continue? Like we started thinking about O'Brien. Is this just O'Brien dealing with his age and with his losses? All this disruption, all this tumult in the first chapter. Now, Stephen might say, Mike, hold on. This is just the entropy of science, right? Everything
Right.
tends towards this here. But I have to admit that finishing that first chapter, I kind of felt like the crew aboard the Surprise in the middle of the storm, even before the collision, just being bounced around from one thing to another. And I'm very much looking forward to finding out just what happens next.
Well, in that case, Mike, what do you say next week to just a little bit more Patrick O'Brien?
Oh, I should like that of all things. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I remember I heard Patrick O'Brien read this and I stopped and I rewound and I listened to it again. And then I opened
Pause.
up my
You
Kindle
didn't hear
and I
Patrick O'Brien
read.
read it. You heard another
Oh,
Patrick read
sorry.
it.
Yes. Sorry, Sam. There you go. When I heard Patrick Tall read this, I had to stop, rewind.